So it's a great pleasure to be here, and it's a great pleasure particularly to celebrate this great alumnus of the University of Glasgow on the 150th anniversary of his birth. There are a number of events planned around people from the borders for his birthday weekend on the 23rd, 24th of August this year. That's not a good time to give a lecture in a university. What I'm going to be talking about today is, of course, Buchan as we know him, but also about the ways in which we could interpret and understand Buchan better and more clearly on a number of levels. First of all, as a Scottish writer. Secondly, as a Scottish thinker and perhaps one of the preeminent, if not the preeminent, writer about the nature of the double nature of Scottish imperial service. As a politician, as a thinker about the British Empire and internationalism, and lastly, well, not lastly, and on the question of Palestine, and lastly, the Buchan, existential Buchan. Buchan, the importance of defining who we are in the wilderness and in solitude. So, the two great themes which I'll be coming back to are security and society, which is the mega Buchan theme, the global Buchan theme, and who we are, what is the identity of this place and of ourselves that we're wishing to make secure, which is, if you like, the micro Buchan theme. But to our tale. So, isn't it strange, really, that there's remains a relative lack, it's been improving in recent years, but still a relative lack of attention for a novelist who is so resolutely in print. And a novelist also who is far more than a novelist. And that photograph there, Buchan and Roosevelt, is one that I'll be returning to because of the important role that Buchan played in the run-up to World War II. But he's also, and this is too infrequently seen probably, he's also a Scottish writer of the 20th century, engaging in the major themes of Scottish writing. And for example, to take Buchan's novels fit into a pattern of contemporary fiction, which would, published in 1927, has got very strong similarities thematically, culturally, and presentationally with Barrett's Farewell, Miss Julia Logan of 1931, and Naomi Mitchison's Corn King and Spring Queen, published the previous year. Both of the Corn King and Spring Queen and Witchwood are explicitly Fraserian novels, drawing on the anthropology of J.G. Fraser. Sycharth River, of course, is very close to Neil Gunn's Quest for Self in Highland River, published the previous year. And Second Sight and John McNabb also return to those issues. Greenmantle and indeed Buchan's spy fiction of the 1910s gives us a whole range, the last one not worth reading, I have to say, Passenger to Frankfurt, the whole range of Christie's espionage and deep state fiction, which extends from the Big Four of 1925 and Why Didn't They Ask Evans all the way through to Passenger to Frankfurt. The themes of the island and the wilderness are there so frequently in Buchan and indeed in his contemporaries. And it's been suggested that the blanket of the dark, midwinter, and no man's land lie behind aspects of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. The search for old Scotland, which is very much a part of Buchan's oeuvre, is of course very much the concern of Renaissance writers like MacDiarmid, Donne, and Muir. But of course, this isn't principally what Buchan is famous for. He's a spy, a rotten sort of ending, and that is his ending, really. At least it is so far. And one of the interesting things about that is, although Buchan is famous for a spy novel, he's famous for one spy novel in particular, which is why Ursula Buchan had to call the recent excellent biography, 39 Steps, A Life of John Buchan. The book is more important in many contexts than the writer. But despite the attention, or the relative attention, compared with other areas of Buchan's work that attends the spy theme in Buchan, there is a lack of attention to some of the deep themes in the spy novels themselves. For example, Buchan is surely the first writer to come up with the idea, not that he's overly fond of its consequences, but the idea which has become, if you read Twitter, and it's been out of order several times in the last 36 hours, which is perhaps a blessing, who's to say. But the idea of a deep state is something which actually derives from Buchan. This passage of 39 steps is one example, but it's not the only reference in Buchan. Away behind all the governments and the armies, there was a big subterranean movement going on, engineered by very dangerous people. He'd come on it by accident. It fascinated him. He went further, and then he got caught. The idea of the spy as outsider, which is actually related to the spy novel's roots in detective fiction, is also present in Buchan, and it was later adopted by Ian Fleming in the person of Richard Hannay. England from the first, I was disappointed with it, is a Hannay quote, which one doesn't expect to find, but this is useful to remember. And of course, that famous quote from the Powerhouse about civilization being a sheet of glass is one which could continue to seem relevant today. Amazingly, despite the fact he helped to immortalize Portland Place in the screenplay for the 1935 39 steps, Hitchcock only spent £800 on the rights, which even in 1935 was not exactly a king's ransom. And that of course, has given vent to a number of successor films and included influences on Hitchcock's own oeuvre, not least in North by Northwest, but also a number of other adaptations of Buchan novels, Hunting Tower, The Three Hostages, John McNabb, Hannay, and Greenmantle. And the screenplay of that 1935 original 39 Steps is recognizable in the light aircraft pursuit and shadowing, which Hitchcock injects, is revisited in the Buzzing of Connery in From Russia with Love in 1963. And of course, many modern playwrights, not least Macari, refer to George Smiley, one of George Smiley's aliases being Mr. Stamfast, refer to Buchan's influence and oeuvre. But I now want to take us beyond the necessary but important roots of Buchan in spy fiction to somebody who is a political thinker who remains in relevance, a premier writer of Imperial Scotland, an advocate of the double nature of Scots imperial thinking and someone who understands it, and his great themes, which I mentioned. And the great question, who are we, is a question for Scots, but it's a question which comes back in many different guises throughout Buchan's career as a Scot. I just take two examples to start with. The Lemnian, the plot of the Lemnian short story, originally published in 1910, and rather interestingly republished in support of the wounded in World War I in 1916, is that a man from the island of Lemnos comes upon the Spartans, whom he hates, fighting the Persians, whom he hates even more. Beginning to sound like the world we know, isn't it? And he decides, after a bit of intellectual argy-bargy with himself, to join the Spartans. It's a rather strange metaphor for Pan-Hellenic alliance and what it is to be an outsider in the Pan-Hellenic alliance, which is what the Lemnian's about. And of course, one can see the reference, if one wishes to Scotland. And in the Grove of Ashtaroth, published in the same year, Astarte, Ashtaroth, is driven from the face of the earth because the stolid Presbyterian who sits in a sacred grove doesn't believe in her. And so in the end, she's absolutely jiggered. Here is this wonderful goddess of seduction and eternal eroticism, trying her best. This guy's just sitting there. In the end, he disappears. Victory. Victory for the Scot, victory for the Presbyterian, victory for the imperialist. And the hero, because this happens in South Africa, and the hero reflects, and then my heartache returned, and I knew that I'd driven something lovely and adorable from its last refuge on earth. Buchan's career, interestingly, he visited England for the first time at 17 to see the site of Flodden. Buchan's career was nonetheless enormously international. And I know it's well known to many in this room, but I just put it on the screen for a moment. And yet, that sense of it not being adequate, which comes in many of the stories, Fontainebleau not least, not being adequate to who we are, who I am, or who we are, recurs. In retrospect, his career seemed lonely, self-centered, and barren. Lethen, as Buchan's analogue hero, writes of himself or thinks of himself in Sycharth River, and I don't care a tinker's curse for success, from John McNabb. I'm not sure that's quite true, looking at Buchan's career, but nonetheless, there is something there which is a gnawing dissatisfaction about the nature of that career and what it represented about himself. And what self was that? Because when we think of Buchan, we do not think of, even though it's in Memory Hold the Door, the White Rose Club, which he was a member of at Oxford, where we drank to the king over the water, where we don't think that he was mercilessly teased for his Jacobite sympathies in the Dear Jacobite era of the 1890s. We don't think that he succeeded the well-known 90s poet who signed his reviews Log Roller for a particular and obvious reason, Richard Le Gallienne, as reader for John Lane. And we don't think of him, despite the fact he writes about it, as somebody who knew and had some intimacy with the souls, or someone who contributed 3 stories to the Yellow Book. Buchan's 90s are a very important part of Buchan, but they're also a disappeared, an absent, a suppressed part of Buchan. When I talk about suppression, No Man's Land, the novella or short story, it's on the cusp between them, which was published in 1899, which talks about the Picts. A man, the hero, protagonist, comes across the Picts, who've become converted into, who are the origin of the fairies, the little people, a suppressed national self, which is fundamentally supernatural. Well, I don't need to invoke Tam O'Shanter to give you the length of that trope's presence in Scottish writing. But it's interesting to see that Buchan sees the state of self as also a state of repression and requiring that repression. And again, half detached and half embroiled, Canada's position seems to be much like my own, very telling quotation from his time as Governor General. So that all through his life, that self is a self who's inside and outside what he's doing. And that inside and outside is sometimes reflected in the fiction. A couple of quotes there. Melfort's by name an Englishman, Prince of the Captivity, 1933, and the object for Lethen in Sycharth River, an Englishman named Lethen. Now, neither Lethen nor Melfort are English. They're obviously and very clearly, throughout the fiction, Scottish. But they're publicly, not unusual at the time, they're publicly reported, reflected, and presented as English. And that's a deliberate part of Buchan's fictional portrayal of the nature of being inside and outside the great game that is involved, the imperial game that is involved in playing. And yet, there are other things in there. Canada must make her own music. A Canadian's first loyalty is not to the Commonwealth, but to Canada, and much more to come, which show a different sort of Buchan. And a sort of Buchan who was also extraordinarily patriotic on Scots causes. President of the Scottish Historical Society, trustee of the National Library of Scotland, an early supporter of MacDiarmid, whose Annals of the Five Senses was dedicated to Buchan. The Sangshaw's preface notes, who was first to note MacDiarmid's use of synthetic Scots. Again, Buchan is an advocate of the Scots language, a supporter of the Scottish National Theatre, and indeed the front for the campaign for the National Trust for Scotland to buy Bannockburn at the beginning of the 1930s. He's deadly serious about all this, and yet, and it certainly doesn't come through the photographs, he's humorous too. Laughter is the chief gift of civilization. I think that when I read the Ezra Pound letters to Buchan and Buchan's responses, Ezra Pound typically writes, Jews international finance, Mussolini, page after page. And very much later, Buchan writes back saying, I received your charming letter. I'm just off to do. I'm just off to do something else. But Ezra Pound, of course, doesn't get the hang of it and keeps up the correspondence. The Scotland that Buchan inherited is one which, as his sister Anna Buchan notes in Unforgettable, Unforgotten, is one where they were brought up with a strong, at the very least, a strong sense of patriotism, to the point, indeed perhaps beyond the point, of Anglophobia at times. That, of course, is not part of what Buchan actually thinks, but he's always concerned about exploring that side of Scottish heritage. In the earlier affection, again from the end of the 19th century, a group of Scots speakers plus a number of Gaelic-speaking Jacobites who are being taken off by British soldiers, and they don't sympathise with it. It's rather like the Lemnian, but they return. Then they find some distance between themselves and the Gaelic speakers, and their sympathy overcomes them for their shared identity, and they go back and clobber the redcoats and liberate. In No Man's Land and Fountainblue, Buchan returns to this sense of repression and the sense of dissociation that you feel when you leave for a greater career as you have to. And sometimes those are very interesting references there. Fountainblue is actually the references to the Treaty of 24th October 1745, committing the French crown to support a full Stuart restoration. And again, I think that's usually missed, but Buchan knows it all right. And of course, in the company of the Marjolaine, he reflects on the futility, ultimately, of Jacobite hopes, not in 1745, but at a much later date. The Scotland he inherits is one where he's very conscious of the spirit of Scottish patriotism. He's conscious, particularly in Wychwood, of the claims of the older religion, Catholicism, and the sense of Scotland's sacrifice as unrecognised, and that Scotland has got itself, frankly, into a paradoxical situation. Again, although I think more positive readings seem to be possible, all roads are the same lead for this way to land at the end of Wychwood, on the inevitability of leaving a country which has effectively snookered itself in terms of the way its religion and identity relate to its history. So it's not every part of one of the interesting things that Buchan writes is that it's not a question of Celtic or Saxon. Every part of Scotland is more or less a racial mixture. If we try to divide Scotland ethnographically, we shall land ourselves in confusion. There is one rule of life between Cape Wrath and the Mull of Galloway, the Scottish character, Highland and Lowland, 1926 to 28. Now, that was really pretty unusual. Still unusual for some, but it's pretty unusual in the late 1920s. And Buchan is getting to the sense, which comes out in other parts of his career too, of the shared nature of the Scottish character and its paradoxical nature, but a nature which is also shared. And in some books, to some extent in Midwinter, but definitely in The Blanket of the Dark, which is centered on England, and again the older pre-Reformation values of England in the 1536 rising, if that's what we would call it, against Henry VIII, sense that there's a deep culture as well as a deep state. And in Scotland, Buchan feels, historically speaking, the deep culture has been compromised by its religious identity and consequence. He explores Scotland present rather than Scotland past, also in a variety of interesting ways. His great Gaelic was the true key to the world because he knew Gaelic speakers in terms of his great uncle's nurse as a child. I used to lament that I had no Gaelic, having, like my father before me, tried in vain to learn. He presents very interestingly, I think. I mean, as well, Walter Elliot said, John Laputa is the real hero of Prester John, and he certainly is, presents a black South African hero in Laputa, in Prester John, who begins as a Scottish minister. And the paradox of Laputa's identity as a Presbyterian minister, that most paradoxical, and of course Buchan's father's occupation, that most paradoxical of roles, is one which he seeks to escape by liberating his own people in South Africa, but which he begins, as the story begins, in Scotland. Buchan deals with issues like absentee landlordism and domestic defiance. Leitham and John McNabb, both Leitham is very much helped by Benji. Benji, and I'll come back to Benji. Benji, I think, is not usually spotted, a wandering Jew figure, but also a homeless figure, and therefore redolent of Meg Merrilies and the Gypsy tradition. The Gypsies, of course, originally being supposedly Egyptians, which makes them the original Scots, thanks to the foundation myth of dating back to Scota, the daughter of Pharaoh. The Macrae deer forest that anchors the Grand Poaching Raid, which is an amalgam of the West Highlands and Skye, has already appeared in the Three Hostages. But it's not just a Benji and John McNabb. He writes about the excluded in, of course, the Gorbals Diehards, who come back in 3 fictions, and he reflects sometimes in Scotland, past on Scotland's present, as his reflection on the Kirk and Nation reports, the menace of the Irish race to our Scottish nationality is reflected on in the quite straightforwardly savage attack on the conduct of the Covenanting soldiers after Philip Hoch in Wychwood. In John McNabb, of course, he also comments on absentee landlordism. Janet, who is the only one who gets of the daughters of the landlords who gets married, and is of course the daughter of the only Scottish landlord, found Lady Cleaverly, one of the incomers, in a Tudor hall which had as much connection with a Scots castle as with a crown. So if you look, there are repeated emphases on change, paradox, and the politically shifting ground of Scotland. So that brings us to politics. So Buchan quotes, "A sane nationalism is necessary for all true peace and prosperity, and I believe every Scotsman should be a Scottish national." Well, what are we to make of these quotes? The general view is that he was a Tory. Well, up to a point, Lord Copper. And I think we need to reflect that Buchan sat as a Unionist MP, and also that the nature of conservatism has changed rather considerably since the 1920s. One of Buchan's clear objections, he does have some unpublished, for example, there's a quotation from an unpublished essay on Scottish Home Rule from the NLS there. Buchan does have some concerns about Scotland's constitutional position. We'll come to this more broadly in the imperial zone, but as you can see there, he has got some interest in devolution/federalism, certainly in 1913, and it feeds into his interest into the way in which the dominions and the current colonies are going to be governed in the future. But his real objection to outright Scottish nationalism is Scotland is far greater and nobler than any little nation, and the argument around that is the global function and the global footprint of Scotland. The Buchan fears too strong a local power base, too strong a Scottish national entity will undermine, that it will turn us inside back to the paradox. And then there are other writers who write, contemporary writers who write in these terms too, back to the paradox of self and away from finding Scotland in the wider world. So I'm certainly not going to argue that Buchan is a sympathiser with the National Party of Scotland or the SNP as it became while he was still in Parliament. But I am going to suggest that Buchan is rather a complicated and thoughtful thinker about the nature of the Scottish Constitution. And he is about the nature of democracy itself. Democracy, the quotes there from Memory Hold the Door, but I think the central part is the minority should be ready to yield to majority, which in turn should respect the minority's sacred things. The respect for minorities' sacred things is absolutely central, and that's why so much of the fiction is actually about sacred things. What are our sacred things? And of course, his reflection on the dictators of Europe is one which he expands on elsewhere. And of course, some of the language belongs to the age, but the writing, although the writing about which I've returned to on the empire, is about the expansion of self-governance and also the point of self-governance. The problem in all politics is to give actual human beings the chance of a worthy life. And the realization of danger, not as by the late 1930s, not even by the early 1930s, but actually even before then, danger inherent in the interwar settlement when he reached the peak of his career, calling the Treaty of Versailles the most half-witted thing ever perpetrated. And I think, and one of the interesting things about the balance in Buchan, and there's always a sense of balance as well as a sense of doubleness, comes out in one voice to Europe in the Daily Graphic in 1931. We are the European powers, and the fortunes of Europe matter desperately, geographically, economically, and politically, within the European family. Simultaneously an imperial, but also a European thinker. And once again, one couldn't resist in the present climate, noting that unlike many people in the United Kingdom, Buchan was well aware that half of his understandings of Britain and America are due to the fact that neither will regard the other as what it is, a foreign country. But there are also a whole range of other smaller issues which illustrate the man and which capture Buchan's attention. So not only is he a supporter or an early supporter of women's suffrage, but he also talks in the pamphlet Women's Suffrage and Logical Outcome of the Conservative Faith of the extended horizon and limited opportunity facing young women today. The potential of the world seems greater than ever, but their opportunities are effectively constrained. So it's actually further than a voting comment, it's a socio-economic comment. And his dislike of ideology, which is lifelong, and I particularly like the quote, when you hear a man talk about dying in a ditch, you would be fairly sure the ditch is his usual habitation. And how true that is. The absolutism of ideology is very stagnant. A ditch indeed is its usual habitation. The campaign which he pushed to Ramsay MacDonald and others on the attack on slum housing and the importance of ensuring that everyone had a decent house to live in the 1930s. The only successful outcome of his political activity, the Private Members Bill to regulate the sale of British songbirds, which is to do with his interest in conservation. And of course, perhaps his single most significant political act, the working on his relationship with Roosevelt to try and get Roosevelt, who was partially willing, Roosevelt to host the peace conference that eventually became Munich and the Munich Agreement. And was part of the reason why Eden's resignation, Eden resigned as Foreign Secretary on the 20th of February 1938, because Chamberlain outright rejected the Roosevelt approach, which Buchan had through his telling Roosevelt endless stories about the borders and the vernacular, and generally being cheerful and engaging, had worked on the US president over the previous few years. It wasn't a done deal. US isolation in the 30s was very powerful as it was to be into the Second World War itself. But it is a very interesting and elusive what if out of the whole canon of Buchan's political achievement. I believe that a close understanding between the British Commonwealth and the Republic of the United States defends the peace and freedom of the world. I say understanding, not alliance. And his desire to maintain a strong relationship with the United States dates back to the early 1920s. But he's also interested in game reserves. He's one of the first people to proposed game reserves for protected species in 1903. He's interested in the earlier dated Indian self-government. He's interested in the limiting of access to indigenous hunting grounds, reform of the lords, and a welfare state. So when we say that Buchan is a Tory, and remember he usually wrote about Tory in revolutionary terms, he wrote about it with an AIGH in it, that he is a very special kind of Tory by the standards of the modern day. So the real duty, as he says, of being a Tory is that of ruthless destruction, because the power to change is essential to preservation. And that power to change is something which he saw interference with any form of reactionary politics. So the paradox is here that Buchan, the Tory, is very much opposed to reactionary politics. 30 years ago, Europe was nominally a Christian continent. It is no longer so today. The treatment of the Jews has been beyond belief brutal. The Third Reich seems a mere oozing of filth from the gutters. That's from Ursula Buchan's biography. It's typically of most of Buchan's writings of this from the early 1930s, not from the late 1930s. The one ism that kills the soul, and that is pessimism. The only way which we can pay our debt to the past is by putting the future in debt to ourselves. And very interestingly, he reaches, as with the game reserves and elsewhere, towards the beginnings of some kind of environmentalist thought, which goes with his love for the wilderness. In, for example, his address to the Engineering Institute of Canada in 1937, the constructive powers of man must keep in some kind of harmony with nature. And once again, you can see these ideas on show in The Future of Western Democracy, 1928, which is concerned even then that democracy is becoming rather unpopular. The whole principle of democracy has been assailed everywhere by skeptical doubts. And I was thinking Mussolini, obviously, at this stage, the threat of a kind of Caesarism, a great personality at the head, a sort of nursemaid's hero, received the worship of foolish, neurotic people who are ready to abase themselves what they call a strong man. So he's absolutely, and in a time when there are an awful lot of fellow travelers or admirers of Mussolini's Italy or Hitler's Germany, he's absolutely and unconditionally, completely opposed from a very early date both. But of course, he is an imperialist. And one of the interesting notes about that is, again, it's not what you expect. And it's worth reading A Lodge in the Wilderness, because there are two key arguments about a lodge in the wilderness: whether the empire should retain, as Dicey suggested, a single central legislative body and not be federal, or whether it should, as abandon, following the E.A. Freeman's historical analysis, again, roughly contemporary with Dicey's, a unitary point of sovereignty would need to be abandoned as the empire developed. And both of those views compete in The Lodge of the Wilderness, which is a piece of faction, as Tom Devine would put it, which is a fictional story that's setting out the political arguments about the nature and development of the British Empire. Buchan's sympathies are with federalism, but he doesn't think you can move to imperial federalism straight away at the beginning of the 20th century. However, what he does think is that jingoism is imperialism's stark opposite. Free play must be given to the dawning nationalism of the constituent states. The true conception of the empire today is that of an alliance of sovereign states. And that's Buchan writing in manuscript in the National Library of Scotland. It's not from A Lodge in the Wilderness. So you can see that Buchan's tendency is towards confederal or federal authority. And in Lodge, some of the outrage concerning the aggrandizement of imperialism finds its voice too. We come among them, outrage their traditions, violate their sanctities, coerce for an unfamiliar bondage. Can we wonder that a high-spirited people rebels with regard to Nigeria? 3 years later, Buchan, of course, published exactly the fictional version of that in Prester John. He remains extremely sensitive, the minorities' sacred rights again, to the minorities of empire, visiting the Inuit, where as Governor General of Canada, giving one acceptance speech, partly in Cree, and making 30 First Nation presentations, repeatedly emphasizing the nature of the importance of local identities within pan or transnational organizations. And I mean, there's some quotes there that you can read, and hopefully people online might be able to see. But in A Lucid Interval, I think published in Blackwoods in 1910, which I particularly like, is about the nature of politics and its relationship to empire. So it's got a relationship with Jekyll and Hyde. There's a potion in a curry, and the potion in the curry turns Tories into liberals and liberals into Tories until they eat the curry again, and then it turns them back, which is a kind of humorous metaphor, laughter the chief gift of civilization again, for the nature of the British Empire and the arbitrary position of politicians about it in different times. And his thinking, I suppose, comes to a crux in what he knew was the book about and for the end of his life, Sycharth River. And I've given you the quote before, retrospect his career seemed lonely, self-centered and barren. But the plot of Sycharth River, I'm sure that many of you know it, but the plot of Sycharth River is that a Scotsman follows a Quebecois into Canada, the Quebecois Gaillard, having abandoned life in the United States to return to his native wilderness, being pursued by a Scot with plenty of hybridized nationalities throughout. And in the end, Leithen, who's going to die anyway, but gives his life before his time to where he belongs, the clan and the family, as he puts it, of the Hares, the First Nations, Native American groups. His guide, fittingly, Johnny Frizzell on the way, is half First Nations, half Scots. That doubleness, the way in which Scotland has to hybridize with the world and with empire, is not one necessarily of ascendancy and power. It's also one of service. His noble frosty egoism emerged from something nobler. He meant to die in the cold cathedral of the north, ceasing to live in a world which had no care for life, which he defines as the imperial world, and even worse, the world at war again, futile waste, the same devilment, the stench of incinerators. Buchan wrote those words in 1939. So he's very conscious of the paradox, inward and outward, the paradox of power and service. For him, civilization has twin foundations, law and liberty. And large entities are necessary to preserve the rule of law, and small ones must have, in their different ways, their liberty. And I mean, I'm not going to be able to dwell on Buchan and universities, but the interesting attack on abstract disciplinarity and the ideological intolerance of disciplines, the narrower they get, the more ideologically intolerant they get, comes from his speech in Edinburgh as Chancellor in 1938. And again, almost whenever he turns to a topic, it has a resonance which endures. And here is a resonance which most definitely endures. Buchan was chair of the Cabinet Subcommittee on Palestine, and Jews and Jewish figures or Jewish avatars occur throughout his fiction. In John McNabb, as I've mentioned, Benjamin Bogle is the son of Esau, and he is described as a nomad against whom the orderly world waged war. He functions both as a gypsy and as the wandering Jew. But this theme is worked out far more comprehensively in A Prince of the Captivity in 1933, though it was written in 1931, or largely written in 1931, the first anti-Nazi novel, which talks about the far-wandered Scots exactly in terms of dispersed Israel. Meir, the Jewish handler of Adam as a spy in the First World War, says to him, "Are we not both working for the peace and felicity of Jerusalem? We will meet someday outside Jerusalem." Buchan, of course, becomes an activist. And I'll go into the details of that, which are not quite so Zionist as we might think, an activist to support the creation of an Israel of a home for Israel in the Palestine Mandate. And his name is described in the Golden Book of Israel. Weizmann talks about Jews everywhere mourning the loss of a great lover of freedom and tolerance, and of a warm and proven friend of the restoration of the Jewish national home in Palestine. He's identified early as a Jewish sympathizer by the Third Reich, and he goes on the SS's top British arrest list, even when he's in Canada. He weren't that smart. Anyway, but interestingly, when he writes, and particularly some of the manuscript material, rather than as well as the Shoreditch speech, in 1933, he writes about Palestine. He talks about, he's quite clear, he's thinking of two autonomous communities in the Palestine Mandate. What does such a Jewish national home imply? He says at the Palestine dinner on 2nd March 1933. One thing it does not imply, the setting up of a Jewish national state to create in favor of the Jews a fresh example of the kind of intolerant national organization found in the rest of the world. There's a question mark after rest only because I'm pretty sure it's rest, it's in Buchan's handwriting. But no more does it give any support to an Arab national state. The Zionist ideal, let me repeat, does not depend so much on the extent of territory upon which a national home would be created, as upon the opportunity which such a home offers for the development of the Jewish genius. Its essence is qualitative, not quantitative. And he goes on to criticize the conduct of the British authorities in the Palestine Mandate. But he's clearly seeing the Palestine Mandate as the envelope, both for a Jewish and for an Arab community. And now, from the globe, I move towards closing this lecture with a little look at the existential Buchan. So, Alien Barn is the island which, it didn't have a bridge over it then, the island which Buchan refers to repeatedly as Adam's ideal in Prince of the Captivity. It's the island of Bruce of Charles Edward at the 1857 Stevenson Lighthouse. And it's also an island on which one can take refuge, and was what Buchan says to the Canadian Medical Association in 1937. Man is a septic animal, and he is given a chance, he poisons himself and his neighbors. An island enables you not to poison yourself and your neighbors. This is, of course, on one level, Buchan's Island is the island that likes to be visited, which appears in, for example, Mary Rose of 1920s, and already it also has relationships to Barry's Neverland and to Compton Mackenzie's Rich People Law, although perhaps not so much to the latter. But the interesting thing is that Alien Barn is not actually particularly remote. It lies, rather like Machray Deer Forest, which is a composite of the West Highlands and Skye, between the West Highlands and Skye. And in Prince of the Captivity, it's repeatedly invoked as a place of identity, a place of self, and also a place, whether by Robert the Bruce or Charles Edward, or Scottish origins, Scottish past. To him, Adam, it was all that the art of literature could give. It was his own sense of value, his own imaginative palimpsest. So one of the interesting things about the way in which that island is used is it is the equivalent of Jerusalem in Prince of the Captivity. It is the place of self which is isolated from the evils of the world, even though both Mayer sacrificed himself for Adam, the Jew sacrificed himself for Scott at the close of the First World War, and the Scot sacrificed himself for the ongoing crisis to be faced by the Jews at the beginning of the 1930s, against the last word in cold, deadly fanaticism, the Iron Hands. This is the place of idealism, the place of separation, to take refuge. It is the wilderness. And the peaks visible from Alien Barn and the Skye Bridge are are all very redolent to Buchan, who almost died in an attempt rather early in the season to climb Buccleuch's Moor in 1898, but who had by 1905 climbed all 27 peaks of the Black Cuillin up to including Sgurr Alastair. So the symbolism of the island and the mountain is very much the symbolism which is at the heart of Buchan's own struggle to identify who he is in the context of all the worlds he inhabits, shaking off the bonds of an alien civilization and worshipping at the altars of the northern wild. Only the north can mend what the north breaks in Sycharth River. Empire is always at risk of sickness. Personal clarity and integrity can help to sustain one in the face of that. The Woodbush Plateau in Zoutpansberg, which appears in Prester John, and similar essays such as The Humour of High Altitudes and The Spectator in 1904, bring a sense of that mountainous quality, which is a repeated, like the island, repeated theme of Buchan's self and selfhood, and of course occurs on the front page of the first edition of Sycharth River. So these are Buchan's great themes. He's very conscious of the persistence of folly through time, of the unreliability and the captiousness of politics and political settlements. Pharisaism, which might be defined as loyalty to conventions which lost any binding spiritual force, is no basis for virtue. 300 years ago, witch hunting and intolerance were considered to be outward proofs of devotion. 150 years ago, slave owning was godliness. And today, there is a universal degree of danger of a kind of state idolatry establishing a tyranny over the human soul, which is addressed before the Montreal Council of Reformed Churches in 1937. For Buchan, who are we is a personal, a national, an imperial, and a global question. But its existential form, addressed in grove, island, and wilderness, is only possible in a secure and stable political context, which itself is a necessity transnational and yet unstable because it is so. The existential question of Scotland is grounded in the paradoxical nature of its past, the double nature of its present, inside and outside British imperial consciousness, and the parallel nations and groups from First Nations to particularly the Jews, who reflect the Scottish experience in different ways throughout the world. But Scotland is, and therefore Buchan as a paramount Scot, is especially fitted to explore the nature of who we are and what is the nature of any society which will make us secure. Because one of the key things about Scotland, historically speaking, and I'm very happy to take that discussion further in a different non-Buchan context, is Scotland is always Scotland and, but it's never more Scotland and than it is for that visionary fiction and political writer whose anniversary we celebrate, John Buchan. Thank you very much.